They kept climbing into her pool, laughing at her special brother, but what she did caused a stir throughout the school. Watch until the end, and write in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe. Lena had never thought of her backyard as anything special. It wasn't fancy like the ones in the glossy magazines her classmates brought to school, and it certainly didn't look like the backyard of someone with money. But to her, and especially to her little brother Zach, it was everything. A patch of modest green grass, bordered by a wooden fence worn by the Arizona sun, and, in the center, an above-ground pool that had come in several shipments the previous summer. She and her mother had assembled it piece by piece with sweat and aching backs, and by the time it was filled with clear water and a blue inflatable ring danced gently across the surface, it had become more than just a place to swim. It became a sanctuary. For Zach, the pool meant freedom. He was 9 years old and diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, a phrase that people often said with pity in their voice, as if it were a slow-burning tragedy. Lena hated that tone. To her, Zach wasn't a tragedy. He was her brother. He was sensitive to loud sounds, flinched at bright lights, and spoke only in short, often fragmented sentences. But when he was in water, he moved with surprising grace, almost joy. The agitation left his body. His hands stopped flapping. His gaze, usually darting and unsure, settled into calm. She loved watching him float on his back, blinking up at the sky, completely at peace. He didn't have many safe places in the world, but the pool, they had built it for him. Their mother, working long shifts at the pharmacy, was hardly ever home before 7. Since their father had left them 6 months ago, Lena had taken on more than any 15-year-old should have to carry. She prepared Zach's meals, helped him with his sensory exercises, ensured he took his medications and stayed alert to any slight changes in his behavior. It wasn't easy. It was never easy. There were days when Zach would collapse to the floor, sobbing for reasons he couldn't explain, and she would sit beside him, holding his hand until his breathing slowed. There were days when he wouldn't eat, or days when he would repeat the same phrase for hours until her ears ached. But there were also moments of laughter, like when he accidentally sprayed water in her face and giggled so loudly it made her cry. The pool made those good moments more frequent. That summer, as school let out and the long heat of June wrapped around Chandler, Arizona like a second skin, Lena established a routine. She and Zach would wake early before the worst of the sun, eat oatmeal with chopped bananas, and then change into their swimwear. Zach loved wearing the same red rash guard every day, and Lena had long given up trying to get him to wear anything else. They would head out the back door together, and for the next hour, the backyard transformed into their bubble of calm. She would sit on a lawn chair, sometimes reading, sometimes simply watching, as Zach dipped and splashed, creating his own underwater symphonies with toy submarines and floating fish. Despite everything, it was a good summer. Their mother, though tired, seemed lighter than she had in months. The financial strain hadn't disappeared, but it no longer felt as suffocating. Lena had stopped hoping their father would call. She had stopped waiting for an apology or an explanation. What mattered now was keeping their world stable, for Zach, and in some ways for herself. The tranquility lasted just over a month. It began with the house next door. The for sale sign came down abruptly one Saturday morning, and by afternoon, moving trucks lined the curb. Lena watched from her bedroom window as a new family arrived. The parents looked young, polished. The mother wore tall sandals and designer sunglasses. The father spoke loudly into his phone while directing the movers. Two teenage boys, maybe 16 or 17, emerged from the back seat of a sleek silver SUV. They were tall, lean, and already shirtless by the time they started hauling boxes. There was nothing remarkable about them, at least not at first. Lena barely paid attention after the initial curiosity. People moved in and out of their neighborhood all the time. And besides, she had more important things to focus on. Zach was having trouble with a new sensory toy, and she had promised him they would test it in the pool that evening. Still, there was something about the way the new family carried themselves that unsettled her. Maybe it was the loud music they played that first night while unpacking, or the way one of the boys carelessly dropped a fast food bag onto their lawn and didn't bother to pick it up. She couldn't quite place the feeling, but it lingered like humidity. Subtle, oppressive. She tried to shake it off. Maybe they were just loud. Maybe they'd settle down. The next morning was quiet again. Zach wanted to swim early, and Lena obliged. They went out at 8, the sun still soft against their skin. Zach was in the water within minutes, humming to himself. Lena opened a book, but found her attention drifting. Her eyes kept flicking over the top of the fence toward the neighbor's yard. The boys were outside again, shirtless, tossing a basketball back and forth on their driveway. They didn't glance her way. She exhaled and focused on her book. The days passed and the routine resumed. Zach's behavior improved, his sleeping stabilized. Their mother even joked one evening, over reheated pizza, that the two of them had made a better team than most adults. Lena smiled, holding back tears. For once, things felt manageable. But the peace didn't last. A week after the neighbors moved in, Lena noticed something strange. She came home from the library with Zach and saw a wet towel draped over one of the lawn chairs by the pool. Zach, holding her hand, pulled back slightly, confused. There was a soda can on the ground and a smudge of muddy footprints near the ladder. The water level in the pool was noticeably lower. She stood frozen, her mind trying to piece together what it meant. Had someone been in their backyard? She glanced at Zach. He looked back at her, fingers twitching nervously. She didn't want to alarm him, so she smiled and said something about the wind knocking things over, but inside a slow burn began. That night, while Zach watched cartoons, Lena stood outside staring at the fence. The latch on the gate was old, a bit rusty, easily forced open if someone wanted to. She remembered the tall boys next door, their easy confidence. Still, she didn't want to assume. Maybe someone had come by mistake. Maybe the landscaper from 2 houses down had checked the wrong yard. But the next day, it happened again. And this time, she knew. Another towel, wet footprints, a pair of flip-flops left behind. Zach didn't want to go outside. He stood near the sliding door, his small hands pressed against the glass, looking out with silent unease. Something had shifted in the air. The sanctuary felt violated. That evening, Lena tightened the gate lock with an old bike chain. She walked the perimeter, double-checking everything. Zach followed her movements with wide, uncertain eyes. She reassured him. Soft words, gentle voice. But she couldn't shake the feeling that their quiet place had been marked. Something was changing. Something was approaching. And Lena, though only 15, could feel it in her chest like an oncoming storm. She didn't know it yet, but the quiet days were over. The following days unfolded with a slow, simmering unease. Lena found herself watching the clock more than usual, glancing through the kitchen window every few minutes, straining her ears for the sound of footsteps or laughter over the fence. The backyard no longer welcomed her, it felt like walking into a room that had been touched by strangers. Even the air smelled different, faintly of sweat and sugary soda left to bake under the sun. She tried to keep everything normal for Zach, clinging to routine like a life vest, but he sensed the shift he always did. He stopped asking to swim. Instead, he sat quietly by the back door during the hours they used to spend outside together. His fingers tapped against the glass in rhythmic patterns. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, again. Repetitive, anxious. He would glance over his shoulder now and then, as if asking for permission to go out, but the tension in Lena's shoulders must have answered for her. She hated it. The backyard had once been their escape, and now it felt like a cage whose door someone else had the key to. The final confirmation came on a Thursday afternoon. Lena returned from a brief trip to the grocery store with Zach in tow and found the gate swinging open, creaking on its hinges in the dry breeze. She stopped dead on the walkway, the plastic bags digging into her fingers, heart clenching as her eyes scanned the yard. The pool ladder had been shifted, turned sideways. A dripping pair of swim trunks hung off the railing. An empty energy drink can lay crushed beneath one of the chairs. Someone had been there, again, and they hadn't even tried to hide it. She sent Zach inside, distracting him with a snack and his favorite puzzle. Alone in the backyard, she picked up the can, the towel, the evidence. Her hands shook, not with fear, but fury. She stormed over to the fence and peeked through the slats, just in time to see one of the teenage boys next door tossing a basketball into a hoop, shirtless, glistening with fresh water. His friend lounged nearby on a lawn chair, earbuds in, clearly unbothered. They acted as if the world belonged to them. Later that evening, Lena tried once again to speak to their mother. The woman opened the door slowly, holding her phone to her ear and looking mildly irritated before reluctantly stepping outside to hear Lana out. Lena explained everything, calmly, politely. She mentioned the gate, the towels, the intrusion, how it affected her brother. The woman sighed, muttering something about teenagers being teenagers. She offered a half smile and a shrug. They probably just thought it was fine since it looked unused, she said, before disappearing back inside without even promising to speak to her sons. Lena stood on their doorstep for a full minute before turning back. Rage boiled in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She wasn't ready to scream, not yet. The next morning, Zach refused to come to breakfast. He sat on the floor of his room, wrapping his arms around his knees, rocking slightly, whispering the same word over and over. No, no, no. Lena knelt beside him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder, but he flinched away. Her heart cracked again. He had never done that before. She coaxed him through breakfast, though he ate little. When she mentioned the pool, just casually, he stiffened. Wouldn't look at her. He didn't say anything, but his eyes were wide and blank, as though something inside him had sealed itself off. It was the clearest signal she'd ever received. Zach no longer felt safe. Lena spent the rest of the day walking through their home like a ghost, unable to focus on anything. Her homework sat untouched on the table. Her mother was at work, and Lena didn't even bother texting her about what had happened. She already knew what the answer would be. I'll talk to someone. Let's not start a fight. Try to ignore them. Ignore them. It was what everyone always said about people like Zach. Ignore the stares, ignore the jokes, ignore the whispers in the hallway or the awkward silences at birthday parties. And now, ignore the fact that strangers felt entitled to their space, their water, their peace. The following weekend brought the worst of it. Saturday morning, Lena noticed the gate had been opened again, though this time the chain she'd used had been completely removed. Not cut, but untangled. Someone had deliberately unlatched it, carefully and quietly. Zach was still asleep inside, and Lena took a deep breath and stepped into the backyard. The sight that greeted her made her throat go dry. There were teenagers in the pool, not just the boys from next door, but a group, 7, maybe 8. Some splashing, others sitting on the edge with their feet in the water. One girl had her phone out, filming as another tried to balance on a floaty. Someone had dragged one of their family's patio chairs closer to the pool and was using it as a towel rack. A speaker buzzed softly with rap music. The scent of weed hung faintly in the air. None of them noticed her at first. She stood there, fists clenched, heart pounding. Every cell in her body screamed at her to yell, to throw something, to grab the hose and spray them all down. But she didn't move. She just watched. And then someone noticed. A boy, laughing, turned his head and froze when he saw her. The others followed his gaze. One girl smirked. Another whispered something and giggled. The boldest of the boys gave her a lazy wave. They didn't apologize, didn't flinch, didn't move. One of them even had the audacity to say something like, "You weren't even using it," and went back to his conversation. Lena turned on her heel and walked inside. She didn't trust herself to speak. Her fingers trembled as she grabbed her phone. She wanted to call the police. But would they care? Would they even come? Would they dismiss her like everyone else had? Instead, she waited. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. She watched from the kitchen as the group eventually filed out, slow and unhurried, tossing towels over shoulders, still laughing. They didn't look back. Zach came downstairs just as they left. He peeked out the window, his mouth set in a tight line, his hands clenching his shirt. He said nothing. Neither did Lena. That night, while her mother dozed on the couch after a long shift, Lena sat alone on the back steps. The yard was quiet again, but not peaceful. The kind of quiet that came after something precious had been taken. She stared at the still water of the pool, the dark reflection of the moon rippling across its surface. Her reflection, ghost-like, hovered beside it. She thought about the people who had told her to be patient, who had told her not to make waves, but all she could think of now was Zach, curled up on the floor afraid to step outside. She thought of the way those teenagers had looked at her like she didn't matter, like her home didn't matter, like her brother didn't matter. Something inside her snapped, not like a twig, but like a rope pulled too tight for too long. A clean break, a decision. If the world wouldn't protect her brother, then she would. And next time, she would be ready. The next morning arrived heavy with heat. The Arizona sun had already begun its quiet assault on the rooftops before Lena opened her eyes. She lay in bed a little longer than usual, listening to the creaking groan of the ceiling fan and the distant hum of a lawnmower. The house was silent except for Zach's occasional muttering from his room across the hall. There were no bird songs, no wind, just the kind of oppressive stillness that made it hard to breathe. She dragged herself out of bed and went through the motions, brushing her teeth, tying her hair into a bun, checking Zach's room. He was sitting in the corner, building and rebuilding a line of small foam blocks over and over. His lips moved but made no sound. He didn't look up when she entered. She didn't expect him to. Downstairs, the kitchen was dim. A bowl of cereal, mostly uneaten, sat on the table from yesterday. Her mother had already left for work, a scribbled note on the counter reminding Lena to check the mail and to make sure Zach took his supplements. No mention of the pool, no mention of the kids, just more of the same. It didn't matter. Lena was no longer waiting for permission to act. She went outside just before noon. The heat struck her like a wall. The yard looked deceptively peaceful. No noise, no invaders, no overturned chairs. The only evidence of yesterday's invasion was a faint circle of wetness left behind on the concrete where someone had spilled a drink and a few strands of synthetic hair tangled in the filter. Lena crouched by the pool, pulling the debris from the skimmer basket, her fingers moving with mechanical precision. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in days. Not when she saw Zach flinch from her touch, not when she found wrappers and crushed cups in the grass, not even when she watched strangers desecrate the only place her brother felt safe. What filled her now was not sadness, but something colder: purpose. By the time the sun reached its peak, she had scrubbed the pool floor, vacuumed the algae from the corners, and straightened every chair. The yard was clean again, pristine almost, like nothing had ever happened. It didn't matter. She knew they would be back. That afternoon, she logged into the school's online portal and printed a copy of her rights as a minor homeowner's guardian. Her mother was technically the property owner, but Lena knew from past experiences with the school that she was often treated as the decision-maker in most practical matters. She also opened a dozen browser tabs: private property laws in Arizona, trespassing regulations, pool safety ordinances. Most of it was vague, unhelpful. The law could protect people like her in theory, but only if they had the time, money, and strength to demand it. She had none of those. Still, something caught her attention: a harmless chemical often used in public pools to identify urine: reactive dye. It wasn't toxic. It didn't stain skin permanently, but it created a vivid pink or blue cloud when activated, embarrassing enough to discourage repeat offenses. She read testimonials from pool owners who swore by it. Lena bookmarked the site and placed an order. It wasn't revenge. It was warning. Like a bee sting: sharp, temporary, unforgettable. That night, she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Zach had finally fallen asleep after 3 melatonin gummies and 2 hours of rocking in his blanket cocoon. Lena's own body was tense with anticipation. She imagined herself confronting the teenagers again, imagined them scrambling out of the pool, their limbs covered in dye. She imagined their laughter choking into silence, their swagger replaced with humiliation. But most of all, she imagined Zach stepping back into the water one day without fear. The chemical arrived 3 days later in a plain brown box. It came with instructions, bright warning labels, and a chart showing dilution ratios. Lena read it all carefully. She kept the container hidden under the sink, behind the extra sponges and paper towels. That same day, she visited the local hardware store and used her savings to buy a motion sensor camera and 2 heavy-duty signs: private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted and warning pool under chemical surveillance. She waited until the sun dipped below the rooftops and the neighborhood softened into early evening silence. Then she went outside with a hammer, the signs, and the container of dye. She installed the signs on the fence and the gate, tilted them slightly toward the street. Afterward, she sprinkled the powder into the pool, watching it dissolve invisibly beneath the water's surface. It was done. The next day was a Friday. The school week ended early. Lena kept Zach inside, even though he wandered to the back door twice, pressing his palm to the glass as though he wanted to test the air. She gently redirected him both times, pretending it was too hot, pretending she didn't see the disappointment bloom across his face. She hated lying to him, but the thought of him being out there when they came back, when it happened again, was unbearable. It didn't take long. At precisely 4:37 p.m., the motion camera pinged her phone. She had been in the middle of slicing apples for Zach, but the alert made her drop the knife onto the cutting board. She opened the app, heart thudding, and there they were. 3 of them at first, shirtless, grinning, scaling the side gate like it was a jungle gym. One of them had a speaker slung under his arm. The others followed soon after. 2 more girls, giggling and shoving each other playfully. They tossed towels onto the chairs, kicked off their flip-flops, and jumped in. Lena stood in the kitchen, frozen. She wanted to scream, to storm outside, to do anything. But she didn't. She waited. At first, nothing happened. They splashed, posed for selfies, danced to music. And then, slowly, the transformation began. One of the boys looked down at his hands. His laughter faded. He lifted his arms, his skin now faintly tinted pink. Another girl shrieked, lifting her legs from the water. She was blotched with a bright magenta hue. Chaos erupted. Someone yelled that something was wrong with the pool. One girl started crying. The boy with the speaker grabbed it and ran. The others scrambled out, slipping on the wet concrete, shrieking and cursing. Lena watched them flee through the camera feed, her hands trembling not with fear, but with adrenaline. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. She felt something electric buzzing through her veins. She wasn't proud, she wasn't even relieved, but she was done being ignored. That evening, the first call came. A woman's voice, clipped and cold, left a voicemail on their landline. "This is Caleb's mother. I don't know what kind of chemicals you've put in your pool, but my son came home covered in dye. You'd better hope he doesn't have a reaction. We'll be speaking to the school about this." Lena deleted the message without replaying it. Zach slept soundly that night. He hadn't asked about the pool all day, but his demeanor had shifted, less anxious, less restless, like he could sense the shift in the atmosphere around them. Lena sat on the edge of her bed and watched him breathe, his chest rising and falling beneath his dinosaur blanket. The next morning, a letter arrived from the school, an invitation to a disciplinary meeting concerning a potential safety violation related to student conduct and property use. Lena laughed out loud when she read it, not because it was funny, but because it was so utterly predictable. She didn't tell her mother about the meeting right away. Instead, she gathered her materials, video footage from the camera, timestamps, screenshots, purchase receipts for the dye, and printouts of the product's safety data. She organized everything into a folder, meticulously labeled and cross-referenced. When she finally told her mother 2 days later, the woman looked exhausted, torn between anger and helplessness. "Do you want me to go with you?" she asked quietly. "No," Lena replied, "I've got it." And she did. By the time she walked into the administrative office that Monday morning, dressed in a pressed polo shirt and jeans, clutching her folder with white knuckles, she was no longer afraid. They could threaten her, they could complain, they could call her petty, vengeful, or overdramatic, but they would never again call her invisible. The meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning. Lena arrived at the school's front office 15 minutes early, her folder clutched tightly in her hand, and a practiced calmness set into her face. She had braided her hair, pressed her clothes, and wiped her sneakers clean the night before. There was something about the ritual of preparation that had steadied her nerves, helped her reclaim control in a situation where she had been made to feel powerless for far too long. Her mother had offered again, one last time, to come with her, but Lena had simply shaken her head. She needed to do this herself. The waiting room was cold and quiet. A secretary offered her a tight, polite smile and gestured toward a seat. Lena sat, spine straight, eyes forward, breathing slowly. When her name was called, she stood without hesitation and followed the assistant principal down the hallway, her footsteps soft but certain. The conference room was small, with a round table at the center and a few cushioned chairs placed around it. 2 school administrators were already seated: Mrs. Dwyer, the assistant principal, and Mr. Hanley, the head of student services. Both wore expressions of professional neutrality, the kind adults used when they didn't want to reveal too much. Lena didn't look at them long. Her gaze shifted to the other people in the room, Caleb's parents. His father, a tall man in a stiff dress shirt, sat with his arms crossed, his jaw clenched. His mother was thinner than Lena remembered, with sharp features and a tired sort of anger resting in her eyes. Caleb himself wasn't there. Lena was glad. She didn't want to see him. They began with introductions, pleasantries, a brief overview of the reason they had all been called together. Caleb's mother wasted no time in launching her complaint. She spoke quickly, her voice rising with each sentence, describing the intentional chemical contamination of the pool and the humiliation her son had suffered. Her husband chimed in occasionally, reinforcing her words with terse statements about health risks and legal consequences. Lena listened in silence, letting them speak. She didn't flinch. When they finally paused, Mrs. Dwyer turned to her. "Lena," she said gently, "do you have anything you'd like to say in response?" Lena opened her folder. She laid out the documents one by one: copies of the product's ingredients, safety certificates, printed screenshots from the company's website. She explained the function of the dye, how it was used in public pools, how it posed no health risk and caused no lasting damage. She provided time-stamped images from the security camera showing Caleb and the others climbing over her fence, dumping their belongings in her yard, and jumping into the pool without permission. She spoke clearly, factually, no anger, no theatrics. When she finished, the room was silent. Even Caleb's parents hesitated, their expressions faltering as they looked down at the evidence. Mrs. Dwyer leaned forward, reviewing the materials, her eyes scanning each page with care. Mr. Hanley asked a few clarifying questions. Had the pool been properly labeled? Were there signs? Did Lena's mother know? Lena answered each one with precision. Yes, yes, yes. Eventually, the administrators excused themselves to review the case privately. Lena was left sitting across from Caleb's parents in a silence that pulsed with discomfort. She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. When the administrators returned, they announced that no disciplinary action would be taken. Lena had acted within her rights as a resident of the property. The school would follow up with Caleb and his peers about appropriate behavior off campus. The meeting was adjourned. Lena walked out of that room with her head held high, her folder tucked under one arm like a shield. She didn't speak to Caleb's parents. She didn't need their validation. What mattered was that someone, finally, had acknowledged that she was not the problem. Back home, Zach was sitting in the living room floor, lining up his blocks. When she came in, he looked up at her for the first time in days. He didn't speak, but his gaze lingered, soft and curious. She sat beside him, legs crossed, and slowly helped him build a new pattern. They didn't say anything, but they didn't need to. The space between them, once filled with fear and uncertainty, felt a little lighter now. That night, she reviewed the footage again, not out of spite, but out of caution. She didn't trust that the incident was over, not entirely. People like Caleb didn't go away quietly, but for now the backyard remained untouched. The signs still hung from the fence. The dye had washed out, but the memory of it lingered. In the following days, she made a list, things that still needed doing. The old latch on the side gate had to be replaced. The camera needed better nighttime visibility. The hedge along the fence could use thickening. She began making small improvements one by one. Each change gave her a sense of control, of reclaiming the space. She didn't tell her mother everything, but her mother seemed to notice the difference. One evening, while Lena was replacing a loose nail in one of the fence boards, her mother came out with 2 glasses of lemonade and sat with her on the steps. They didn't talk about the pool. They didn't need to. Word spread quickly around the neighborhood. Some people whispered about the incident. A few gave her curious looks when she passed. One neighbor, a woman Lena barely knew, stopped her on the sidewalk to say, "Good for you." That was all. Just those 3 words. But they meant more than she expected. At school, things were more complicated. Caleb wasn't suspended, but he was noticeably quieter. Some of his friends avoided Lena entirely. Others threw glances her way when they thought she wasn't looking, but no one bothered her directly. She was no longer invisible, and that, at least, was progress. A week later, she received a message from a local journalist who covered community news. He had seen a post on a neighborhood forum and wanted to talk. At first, Lena hesitated. She didn't want attention. She didn't want to make things harder for Zach. But after some thought, she agreed. They met at the local park. He asked questions. She answered simply and honestly. She talked about Zach, about the pool, about how people looked the other way when boundaries were crossed. The article came out 2 days later. The headline read, "Teen Protects Brother's Sanctuary from Neighborhood Intrusion." It wasn't dramatic or sensational, just truthful. The photo was of the backyard, clean, quiet, with the signs still posted on the gate. Lena read the piece once, then folded it and put it in her drawer. She didn't need to see it again. It was enough to know it existed. The response was immediate. Parents of children with disabilities reached out with messages of support. A woman in Phoenix offered to donate sensory toys. A man in Tucson sent a message saying his own daughter had experienced something similar and how proud he was of Lena for standing her ground. For the first time in a long time, Lena felt less alone. The school began implementing a new sensitivity workshop focused on inclusion and respect for neurodivergent students. It was a small step, but Lena knew it mattered. She saw it in the way some teachers started adjusting their tone when speaking to Zach, in the way certain classmates moved their chairs to make room for him, in the way Zach smiled more often now, even if just briefly. Then came the invitation. A nearby private academy, known for its support programs for children with special needs, reached out to their family. They had seen the article. They wanted to offer Zach a full scholarship. The letter was formal and warm, explaining how their staff specialized in individualized support, how they believed Zach would thrive in an environment designed for him. Lena watched her mother read the letter 3 times, tears forming in her eyes each time. They had never imagined such a thing was possible. Not for them, not with their limited means. But now it was. Lena didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel heroic. She felt tired. But beneath that fatigue was something steadier, pride. Not in the attention, not in the article, but in the fact that her brother had a future that no longer looked like a locked gate and a stolen place. A future shaped not by what had been taken from them, but by what she had been brave enough to reclaim. The backyard remained quiet in the evenings. Zach started asking to go outside again. First, just to sit on the edge, then to dip his feet, then, finally, to slide into the water with the small, cautious joy she remembered from before. Lena sat beside him every time, her book in her lap, her eyes scanning the fence out of habit. But no one came. Their sanctuary had been returned, not by law, not by force, but by resolve. By a girl who had been told to stay quiet and chose instead to act. It wasn't over, not completely. Life never offered such clean endings. But the worst had passed, and Lena was no longer waiting for someone to save them. For the first time in weeks, the backyard was still, not because it had been abandoned or overrun, but because it had been reclaimed. Lena felt it in the way the breeze moved through the hedge without interruption, the way Zach's toys remained precisely where they were left, untouched by strangers' hands. There was a quiet order returning, one that had been absent far too long, and though it was fragile, she held on to it like something sacred. But she knew better than to assume the consequences were over. It started with whispers. At school, Lena noticed a shift, not immediate, not loud, but present. In the hallway, some students avoided her gaze. Others glanced quickly at her and then away, their expressions unreadable. It didn't feel like shame, nor did it feel like hostility. It was a tension that hovered in the space between respect and discomfort. They knew what had happened. They knew who she was now. Caleb returned to school a few days after the meeting. He walked the halls with his usual posture, but there was something clipped in the way he moved, an alertness in his eyes like someone who knew people were talking about him. He didn't speak to Lena. Once, their paths crossed outside the cafeteria. Their eyes met for only a second. He looked away first. Lena thought she would feel triumph in that moment, or satisfaction at least. Instead, she felt nothing. No joy, no anger, no fear, just a tired sort of clarity. He wasn't important. What he'd done had mattered, yes, but only because it had wounded her brother. Now, that wound was closing, and he was irrelevant. At home, life settled into a new rhythm. The article had brought a wave of attention that Lena hadn't expected, and while most of it was supportive, it also carried the weight of eyes. People who hadn't looked twice at her before now regarded her with something bordering on admiration. Adults spoke to her with more weight in their tone. A teacher she barely knew asked if she'd ever thought about leadership roles. A neighbor offered her a job walking dogs in the evening. It was strange being seen, but Lena didn't crave visibility. What she wanted was what she had been fighting for all along: quiet, safety, dignity. Zach seemed to feel it too. He began returning to the backyard with cautious steps, watching the water as though it might betray him. Lena never pushed. She simply opened the sliding door each morning, sat on the porch, and waited. He came on his own in time. First to sit on the edge, then to dip his toes. Then, on a warm afternoon 2 weeks after the disciplinary meeting, he walked down the steps into the pool, shivering slightly but not backing away. He floated for 10 minutes that day, silent and calm. When he climbed out, his lips were blue from the cold, but he smiled. Lena cried quietly behind her sunglasses. She added new signs to the gate, not warnings this time, but statements of fact. This space belongs to Zach. Another one said simply, "Respect lives here." She didn't care if anyone thought it was cheesy. It was true, and sometimes truth needed to be visible. Then, one evening as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in soft oranges and muted purples, the knock came. Lena opened the front door to find a girl she recognized from school standing there, her expression uncertain. Marissa. One of the girls who had jumped into the pool that day, who had laughed when the dye spread across her legs, who had run without looking back. Now she stood holding something in her hands, a plastic bag, partially see-through, with a towel inside. "I think this belongs to you," she said, barely above a whisper. Lena didn't speak. She simply stepped aside. Marissa didn't come in. She placed the bag on the porch and turned to leave. But then she hesitated. "I didn't know your brother was different," she said quietly. "I just thought he was weird. I didn't know." Still, Lena said nothing. Marissa looked down at the ground. "I'm sorry, not because we got caught, but because I was cruel." Lena waited, unsure if she felt anything. She wasn't angry. That part had burned out long ago. She wasn't sure she forgave Marissa either, but maybe that wasn't the point. "Thanks," Lena finally said, nodding toward the bag. The girl walked away. After that, nothing happened for a while. The neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for someone else to make a move, but no one did. The backyard remained untouched. The gate stayed closed. The cameras went off less and less. One afternoon, the school counselor pulled Lena aside. She spoke carefully, explaining that the article had sparked internal conversations among the staff. They were considering new programming for students with special needs. Inclusion, education, boundaries. They wanted to do better. Would Lena be interested in helping? She was stunned, not because she didn't think it mattered, but because no one had ever asked her to lead before. She agreed cautiously. It started with a meeting, then a second. Then she was invited to speak in front of a small group of teachers. She spoke about Zach, about how safety wasn't just about locks and fences, but about dignity. She spoke about what it felt like to scream for help in silence and be ignored. Afterward, a teacher approached her with tears in her eyes. "I didn't know," she said. "I've had your brother in class for months, and I didn't know how to reach him. But now I want to try." Things were changing. Slowly, quietly, but they were. Meanwhile, at home, preparations began for Zach's new school. The academy that had offered him a scholarship sent over documents, resources, a welcome kit with visuals and tactile samples. Zach touched each one carefully, his eyes lighting up as he recognized a picture of a sensory room. Their mother cried when she saw him smile like that. The transition would take time. Assessments, meetings, schedules, but it was happening. Lena sat with her mother one evening, the sun low behind them, Zach splashing gently in the pool. They didn't speak for a long time. Then her mother reached over and took Lena's hand. "I don't say it enough," she said softly, "but I see what you've done. And I'm proud." Lena didn't answer. She couldn't. The lump in her throat was too large. Later, after Zach had gone to bed and the house was still, Lena went outside. The moon was bright, casting silver ripples across the surface of the pool. She walked slowly along the fence line, checking the lock, adjusting the camera, reading the signs. Then she sat. Alone with the night and the sound of distant traffic, she let herself breathe. Not because the fight was over, but because she had learned something vital. People would take whatever they thought you didn't have the strength to defend. And if you didn't speak, they would speak for you. But sometimes, even when your voice trembled, even when your hands shook, even when you were young and tired and unsure, the simple act of standing your ground could change everything. The dye had faded from the water, but its impact remained. and so did she. The days that followed moved with a slower rhythm, as if time itself had been tempered by the effort it had taken Lena to restore her family's sanctuary. There were no new incidents, no laughter spilling over the fence from next door, no stray towels left abandoned on the chairs by the pool. The teenagers had vanished from their yard like a seasonal disturbance that had finally passed. It should have brought peace, and in many ways it did, but Lena remained alert. Quiet did not always mean safe. She checked the gate each morning, testing the padlock to make sure it was still intact. The signs she had posted were slightly faded now, sun-bleached and weather-worn, but she refused to take them down. They were her boundary markers, reminders not only to others, but to herself. This space was protected. This space was theirs. The neighborhood around them shifted subtly, as if taking cues from the invisible current of the story that had swept through it. Some neighbors offered polite nods when they passed her on the street. Others remained silent, avoiding eye contact altogether. There was a fragility to the way people addressed her now, as though uncertain whether to applaud her resolve or resent her disruption of the unspoken social balance. At school, her presence was met with a different kind of tension. Not hostility, exactly, but wariness. She had become, in the eyes of many, the girl who made a spectacle of a private matter. Not everyone agreed with the way she had handled it. There were muttered comments behind her back, about attention-seeking, about overreacting. Lena heard them but didn't respond. There was no point. They hadn't seen what she had seen. They hadn't stood helpless while someone laughed as her brother flailed in panic. Their opinions didn't deserve space in her mind. She moved through her days with quiet determination. She attended classes, turned in assignments, and participated in the meetings the school now held on inclusivity and respect. She sat in on sessions with the administration and special education coordinators, sharing her experiences, offering insights into what it was like to grow up as both sister and guardian to someone like Zach. At first, she had felt out of place, a child among adults, but over time, that feeling faded. She had lived through more than most of them would ever understand. It was during one of these meetings that the principal pulled her aside and handed her a sealed envelope. "This came for you," he said, his tone unreadable. Lena took it without speaking, her fingers brushing the thick paper. Inside was a formal letter from the state's Youth Leadership Initiative, a community program designed to support and elevate teenagers who had demonstrated resilience, advocacy, or civic engagement. Someone had nominated her. She read the letter 3 times before folding it neatly and tucking it into her backpack. She didn't tell anyone about it, not even her mother. Not yet. At home, Zach's world was blooming again. He had returned to the pool with confidence, his body moving through the water with the familiar grace that had always calmed him. His new school had begun a slow intake process. Visits, assessments, interviews with specialists who spoke in warm, reassuring tones. Lena accompanied him to each appointment, taking notes, asking questions, watching carefully for signs of discomfort. He clung to her hand sometimes, but he never resisted. He understood, in his own way, that something better was coming. Their mother seemed lighter now. There were still long hours at work, still unpaid bills, still the quiet burden of exhaustion behind her eyes. But she laughed more. She cooked dinner on weekends. She asked about Lena's classes, about Zach's routines. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Then, one afternoon, as Lena sat in the kitchen reviewing a list of accessibility features recommended by the new school, the doorbell rang. She rose cautiously, wiping her hands on her jeans, and opened the door. It was Caleb's father. He stood on the porch in a crisp white shirt, arms folded, expression flat. For a moment, Lena simply stared at him, unsure if she was imagining things. He looked taller than she remembered, older somehow. "I'd like to speak to your mother," he said. "She's not home," Lena replied, her voice steady. He paused, glanced past her shoulder, then back at her. "Then I'll speak to you." She didn't move. "I came to say that I think what you did, what you said to the school, the article, the die, you embarrassed my son. You caused problems for my family." Lena said nothing. "But I've also seen what came of it. I've seen how people talk to kids like your brother now. I've seen the school starting to change. So, maybe it wasn't all bad." There was no apology, just a truce offered in vague, reluctant words. Lena didn't thank him. She didn't invite him in. She closed the door gently after he left and stood in the hallway, her hand still resting on the knob. She didn't feel vindicated, but she felt acknowledged, and that was something. In the following weeks, the backyard blossomed into what it had once been. Zach spent long hours in the water, sometimes with Lena, sometimes alone, always safe. She planted a few flowers near the fence, low-maintenance marigolds that added a splash of color without demanding too much care. The grass grew patchy in places, but she didn't mind. It was lived in, honest. One evening, as twilight settled over the neighborhood, she received a message on her phone. It was from a girl in another town, someone she didn't know. The message was long and halting, filled with hesitations and misspellings, but its meaning was clear. The girl had a brother like Zach. Her family was struggling. She had read the article. She didn't know what to do. Lena replied carefully, thoughtfully. She didn't offer advice. She shared her story. She told the girl she wasn't alone. Afterward, Lena sat outside, her phone resting beside her, her gaze on the water. The moon reflected softly on the surface. From inside the house came the muted sounds of Zach humming to himself as he lined up toy fish on the living room rug. The air smelled faintly of chlorine and night-blooming jasmine. She thought about all the people who had told her to be quiet, the ones who had rolled their eyes, who had shrugged off her concerns, who had said it was just kids being kids. She thought about the teachers who had looked through her brother, the administrators who had nearly punished her for protecting him, the neighbors who had watched and said nothing. And then she thought about the girl who had messaged her, the teacher who had thanked her, the neighbor who had nodded, her mother's voice when she said she was proud. For the first time, Lena allowed herself to feel what she had denied for so long, not anger, not fear, not even relief. Strength, not the kind that shouted or threatened or forced its way into rooms. The quiet kind, the kind that built fences and then stood by them, the kind that said no, even when no one else agreed, the kind that came back again and again, no matter how many times it was dismissed. She had stood alone, and the world had finally turned to listen. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was the moment she realized she had changed its direction. The final weeks of summer passed with a steadiness Lena had almost forgotten was possible. The days no longer arrived like challenges to be overcome, but like small, steady gifts. She woke each morning without dread, prepared breakfast with Zach while sunlight filtered softly through the blinds, and took comfort in the quiet hum of the world as it settled into its rhythm. The pool, once a battleground, had become a place of healing again, its blue surface reflecting not only the sky but the sense of peace that had been so hard won. Zach's confidence returned in degrees, measured by the way he moved through the yard without hesitation, the way he reached for the pool ladder on his own, the way he no longer flinched at the faint sounds that drifted over from neighboring yards. His laughter, quiet, sudden, unmistakable, began to fill the air again. Some days he floated silently for almost an hour, his eyes closed, arms loose at his sides, breathing in time with the water's gentle sway. Watching him, Lena felt something deeper than relief. She felt restoration. She had brought him back. The transition to his new school was nearly complete. Their mother had filled out the last of the paperwork, spoken with the new teachers, toured the classrooms. Lena had accompanied them on that visit, noting every detail, watching Zach's reaction carefully. There had been no fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, no crowds or shouting in the halls. The walls were painted in warm tones, with quiet rooms designed for comfort and calm. One of the aides had knelt beside Zach and offered him a soft, textured toy without speaking. He had taken it and smiled. Lena knew then that they had made the right choice. Their mother's shifts remained long, but her presence at home grew more grounded. There were fewer silences filled with exhaustion, fewer dinners eaten in front of the television. She asked about Lena's schoolwork, about Zach's progress, about the garden Lena had started planting along the fence. She didn't say it outright, but Lena could see the shift in her eyes. Something had lifted. Something had healed. In the backyard, Lena replaced the motion sensor batteries, trimmed the hedge, and repainted the faded signs. She added another, smaller, simple, discreet. It read, "Protected, not abandoned." She nailed it gently to the base of the pool ladder, where only those who entered the water would see it. She wanted Zach to read it, even if he never said the words aloud. She wanted him to feel it in the way she felt it. One morning, Zach emerged from his room already wearing his swim shirt and holding his towel. He walked past her, through the kitchen, and stood by the sliding glass door without a word. Lena rose and followed. Outside, the air was warm but soft, the sun just high enough to cast long shadows across the grass. She opened the door, and he stepped out without hesitation. He entered the water smoothly, floating on his back within seconds, eyes open this time. Lena sat in the chair nearest to him, her book resting in her lap, unread. She didn't want to look away. Not from this. He turned toward her once, lifting his hand from the water to wave. Not the small flutter of fingers he used when overstimulated, but a full, open wave, his eyes meeting hers. She waved back, the corners of her mouth lifting as a lump rose in her throat. There was nothing more she needed from that day. Later, as the sun slid behind the rooftops, they ate dinner together on the back porch. Grilled sandwiches, apple slices, lemonade. Their mother joined them after work, still in her uniform, her hair tied back loosely. They sat in the growing dusk, the sounds of summer playing softly in the distance. Crickets, the occasional bark of a dog, a far-off lawnmower humming to silence. No one mentioned the past. There was no need. A few days later, Lena received a letter in the mail. It bore the logo of the youth leadership initiative she had been nominated for earlier in the summer. She read it slowly, line by line, beneath the porch light, her heart steady. They had accepted her. The fall session would begin in October. She folded the letter and held it in her hands for a long time before slipping it into the folder where she kept everything important. Notes from Zach's therapist, her volunteer forms, the printed screenshots from the security camera that had once captured her desperation in real time. She thought about the first time she had sat outside that door, helpless, afraid, watching strangers violate everything she had tried to protect. She thought about the tears she hadn't let herself cry, about the silence she had been forced to accept. Now, all of that felt like a shadow at her back, distant but still part of her shape. She hadn't erased it. She had grown around it. The next morning, she received a message from her English teacher, asking if she'd consider writing a piece for the school newsletter. Something personal, the teacher said, about boundaries, about standing up, about what you've learned. At first, Lena wanted to decline. She was tired of retelling the story, but that night, as Zach lay sleeping and the house finally quieted, she sat down at the kitchen table and opened her laptop. The words came slowly at first, then, all at once, pouring from the place she had guarded so fiercely all summer. She didn't write about revenge. She didn't write about humiliation. She wrote about space, about what it meant to claim it, to defend it, to declare that some things are not up for debate. She ended the piece with a question. What would the world look like if we protected each other's peace the way we protect our own? The teacher published it a week later. Students stopped her in the hall to mention it. One girl from her class asked if she could show it to her sister. A boy Lena barely knew told her he had started locking his own backyard gate, not out of fear, but because her story made him think about what was his to keep. Lena didn't seek praise, but the ripple mattered. Her reputation at school changed again, not into popularity, but into something steadier. Respect. Teachers listened when she spoke. Students gave her space when she needed it. Some even asked questions about Zach, not out of curiosity, but to understand. The air around her shifted, not because she had demanded it, but because she had held her ground long enough for people to realize they needed to move. One afternoon, a former teacher of Zach's approached her in the library. He was a quiet man, gentle, often overlooked. "I want you to know," he said, "I look at my students differently now. Your brother helped me do that." Lena nodded, too full to speak. As September crept in and the edge of the summer heat began to fade, Lena stood one evening at the edge of the pool, watching the water glow in the last of the daylight. Zach sat nearby with a book of animal pictures, naming them softly under his breath. Her mother was inside, cooking something that smelled like rosemary and garlic. Everything was ordinary. And that was the miracle. She thought about the path behind them, the stolen hours, the violations, the fear, and how it had led here, not by accident, but by force of will. She had drawn a line not just in the dirt, but in the world. They had tried to cross it. She had made them retreat. Now, as darkness fell and the porch light flickered on, Lena turned to go inside. Zach followed, his towel wrapped loosely around his shoulders. Behind them, the water stilled, and the world stayed quiet. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out the next video and feel free to share this one with someone who needs to hear it.